Hello, we continue with Hedda Gabler. In considering Act 1 of Ibsen's play at the end of last class, I'd begun to analyze Hedda's exchange with Thea Elvsted, a pale, nervous little woman who used to be Hedda's younger schoolmate and who has now come to see her to implore Hedda and Tesman to show hospitality to Eilert Lovborg, a former admirer and close, intimate friend of Hedda's who has worked as a tutor to Thea's stepchildren for the past several years. Almost immediately, Hedda intuits that Thea has fallen in love with Lovborg and has followed him to the city, where he's being celebrated for his just-published book on the sweeping, ambitious topic of the March of Civilization. Wanting to confirm her suspicions about Thea, Hedda coerces her visitor to disclose this, that she has come to be with Lovborg, and much more, and she does so through an invented pretense of their girlhood intimacy. Now, before Thea arrives, we've learned that Hedda has resented Thea since they were schoolgirls. She refers to Thea's, quote, irritating hair, which Ibsen describes as, quote, light, almost flaxen, unusually abundant and wavy. Why is this hair so irritating to Hedda? Well, what angered her, and still angers her, about this blonde mane is this. She sees it as the mark of Thea Elvsted's ultra-femininity, her conventional feminine softness, which Hedda sees as a weakness in woman, as a kind of stereotypical conformity to what patriarchy wants and expects a woman to be, the very things that Hedda is rebelling against. Hedda despises this feminine weakness, and so, when Thea arrives, she delights in physically controlling and psychologically manipulating her. Noting that there is something that Thea is hiding, says, there's a great deal more. I can see that. Sit here, and we'll have a cozy, confidential chat. She forces Mrs. Elvsted to sit in the easy chair beside the stove and seats herself in one of the footstools. Thea, anxiously looking at her watch, but my dear Tesman, I really must be on the point of going. To which then she says, when she's asked, tell me something about your home, Thea says, oh, that is just what I care least to speak about. Oh, but please tell me, dear, weren't we schoolfellows? Yes, but you were in a class above me. Oh, how dreadfully it was. I was afraid of you then, Hedda. Afraid of me? Yes, dreadfully, for when we met on the stairs, you used always to pull my hair. Did I really? Yes, and you once said you would burn it off my head. Oh, that was all nonsense, all nonsense. So now we're going to renew our old friendship. You must say do to me. You must use the intimate, the familiar pronoun with me, my dear. Now, Hedda literally pushes Thea into a chair and then plays on this invented idea of an old friendship that didn't exist in order to extract information about her, from her about Lovborg. She tortured Thea as a girl, threatening to burn off her golden locks, and she's capable of torturing her now. Remember that Hedda was what Ibsen describes as a class above Thea, both in school because she was a year older, but also socially as an aristocrat. And this creates in Hedda a disdain for Thea that combines with her dislike for Thea's hyperfemininity. But what emerges, we're going to see, beyond this disdain and hatred, surprisingly for Hedda, is jealousy at Thea for several things. First, Thea admits in this conversation that she has indeed left her husband. And this confession, once Hedda extracts it, seems to come as a relief for Thea, an unburdening. When Hedda says, imagine you're daring to do that, Thea says, I shall never go back to him. Now, despite Thea's soft appearance and yielding manner then, she surprises Hedda because this woman has acted rebelliously, even recklessly, in a way that Hedda would like to act perhaps, but has not yet risked because she fears social censure so much. Hedda is constrained by her concern for social opinion, which Thea courageously rejects. Indeed, Thea tells Hedda, when Hedda is amazed at this flight, she says, oh, it's impossible to keep these things a sort of secret. But Hedda says, but what do you think people will say of you, Thea? To which Thea replies, they may say what they like for all I care, that I must live here where Elbert Lovborg lives. If I am to live at all, that is all I care about. Now, note that Thea not only in this moment doesn't conform to Hedda's idea of her stereotypical female weakness, but Thea arouses jealousy in Hedda by acting out Hedda's own stifled transgressive desires. But Hedda is jealous of Thea for other reasons as well that emerge in this colloquy. She's jealous of Thea's close relationship with her old intimate friend, Eilert Lovborg. Even though Thea and Lovborg clearly were not sexual lovers, Thea has been nonetheless close to him. And she is in fact so passionately devoted to Lovborg that she has repudiated her marriage and risked her reputation in seeking him in the city. Thea feels enlivened by this passion, and Hedda, who complains of her own deadening boredom, envies that sense of life that this devotion to Lovborg has infused in Thea. But the deepest source of Hedda's unexpected jealousy lies in what Thea refers to when she says, quote, I gained a sort of influence over Eilert. He talked to me about such an infinity of things, and then came the lovely happy time when I began to share in his work, when he allowed me to help him. Oh, he did he? Yes, he never wrote anything without my assistance. Now, we need to remember that as a woman, Hedda believes that the only form of self-fulfillment and empowerment in life possible would come from influencing, from shaping a man to achieve greatness. Thea seems to have achieved this in her relationship with Lovborg. She was his muse, his inspiration, and his intellectual companion, and even, Thea says, his equal. And in her domestic role, Thea also helped to control Lovborg's alcoholism. Now, remember that in their past relationship, when Hedda was much younger, she failed to inspire this kind of creative accomplishment in Lovborg when they were emotionally intimate, nor could she in any way save him from his drunkenness and dissipation. Thea has achieved both. Now, despite this accomplishment with Lovborg, Thea confesses to Hedda that she is uncertain about their relationship and about Lovborg's feeling for her, because she complains that there is, quote, the shadow of an unnamed woman that stands between Eilert Lovborg and herself, something that makes her anxious, particularly because he is now in the city where she believed this woman lives. Now, Thea incorrectly assumes that the rival that she fears is a red-headed woman who lives in Oslo. As we later discover, that woman that she is referring to is one Mademoiselle Diana, a would-be singer who is actually the madame or procuress of an expensive brothel that Lovborg used to frequent in his wilder days when Hedda knew him. But the real shadow who haunts Lovborg's thoughts and who poses a threat to Thea is, of course, though Thea does not know it, Hedda. Even though Hedda's earlier relationship with Lovborg ended when she threatened to shoot him with one of her father's pistols, he has been unable to put the memory of Hedda behind him. Now, I hope you noticed in the scene from the 1963 film that I linked you to how Ingrid Bergman smiles slyly in the foreground in a close-up when she hears these words about the shadow of another woman from Thea. She knows she's that other woman. Thea's reference to that shadow, combined with the idea that Thea desires Lovborg, incites in Hedda an invigorating feeling of rivalry, the first sense of interest in life that she's had for some time. Unknowingly then, ironically then, Thea has reawakened both Hedda's romantic desire for Loveborg and reawakened Hedda's old ambition of directing and collaborating with this man of such personal dynamism and intellectual prowess, now recognized. It's clear that Hedda wants to supplant Thea as Loveborg's muse and intimate, and this ambition gains greater impetus when she learns two additional pieces of information about Loveborg from Braque. First, Braque mentions that Loveborg's well-connected and influential relations, who had cast him off during his years of dissipation, have now, it seems, re-embraced him, now that he is a celebrated author. And the second thing she learned from Braque is that Loveborg is now being considered, apparently, allegedly, for the professorship that Tesman thought was certainly his. Now, far from expressing sympathy for her husband at this moment of consternation, Hedda relishes the idea of two men competing for this position. She says, "I am most eager to see who wins." After all, Hedda now considers herself in competition with Thea, though poor Thea doesn't yet know it. Hedda cannot abide weakness in herself, in women, and certainly not in any man. To be weak is to be unworthy of her attention, and she fears that George Tesman is weak. Now, the economic repercussions of Braque's announcement about the appointment turn her even further against Tesman and toward his rival, Loveborg. In his attempts to indulge Hedda and to impress society, Tesman has foolishly overspent, not only on their honeymoon trip, but on the house. He's already in debt now, and his academic appointment is uncertain, and he and Hedda must therefore forego, he says, the status symbols that she felt are necessary to play the prominent role in society that Hedda feels she is entitled to play, and that would confer on her, perhaps, some compensatory power as a woman. She reminds Tesman, quote, "It was part of our compact that we were to go into society, to keep an open house. That is to say, to have the best people come here and make our house a kind of hub of social power and influence." Now, that word compact is interesting, a kind of prenuptial arrangement, so it seems. We realize that Hedda married Tesman then, not simply to mold him as a scholar and a writer, but also in the hope of entering society's power circles through that marriage, though he is only a bourgeois academic. Nonetheless, she believed she could do so, and that understanding was part of their premarital contract. Now she feels that Tesman has disappointed her, even betrayed her, both as a rising academic, and he seems perhaps not rising at the moment, and also failed her as an instrument that would provide a framework for her social prominence, or her reacquisition of a social prominence that she had when she was her father's daughter before he died. Later in the day, when Braque says, "You thought, like everyone else, and expected George Tesman to attain the highest distinction," Hedda says, quote, with fatigue, "Yes, I did then. But now that kind of distinction in Tesman seems unlikely." In her bitter resentment toward him, Hedda ends Act 1 by preparing to brandish one of her father's pistols in a state of cynical self-amusement. She says, "Well, I shall have one thing at least to kill time with in the meantime." Tesman, beaming, "Oh, thank heaven for that. What is it, Hedda? Eh?" To which Hedda, in the middle of the doorway, looks at him with a covert scorn and says, "My pistols, George." Now, when Hedda refers to killing time here with her pistols, we realize that in addition to her rage and frustration at the prospect of smothering domesticity and the agony of being a woman with no ready instrument to power, that in addition to these things, she's also desperately and dangerously bored. So when she speaks then of killing time, at one level she means distracting herself with the pistols to make time pass. But at another level, her words killing time recall the captain in Wojciech. She would like, as he did, to kill off time, to make time disappear, because she finds each hour of her life so empty and so tedious. Now, the pistols that she refers to here, and which we'll see shortly hereafter, are one of the play's richest symbols. First, their phallic shape and potency embody the masculine properties that Hedda envies in men and covets for herself and fetishizes in her frustration in the form of the gun because she doesn't possess them. Second, the pistols are a symbol of Hedda's family lineage. They're her father's pistols, and thus a symbol of her sense of aristocratic power and entitlement, which she wants to regain. And finally, the guns are unmistakably a suggestion of Hedda's capacity for violent action, an action of violence both by way of destroying others and potentially herself. Now, indeed, when Act 2 opens a few hours later, Hedda is standing at the open glass door and pointing one of these pistols at whom? At Brock, who has returned now using the back door and the garden entrance because he doesn't want to be spotted coming to see Hedda alone. Keep that in mind. As he later says, I have no objection to back ways. They may be piquant enough at times. Indeed, he's coming the back way because, as we'll see, he is planning a seduction. Now, Hedda sees him at a distance and fires her gun. Not quite what Brock was expecting. Now I'll shoot you, Judge Brack, she said, raising her pistols and pointing. Brack calling unseen, No, don't stand aiming at me. Well, this is what comes of sneaking in the back way, Judge. She fires. Brack near. Are you out of your senses? Oh, dear me. Did I happen to hit you? Brock, still outside. I wish you would let these pranks alone. Oh, come in then, Judge. Now, note that when Hedda fires, it's more than merely the prank that Brack claims it is. It's more than simply what she had suggested earlier to Tesman, a way of distracting herself and relieving her boredom. There's more to it. Although Hedda says, oh, I'm only firing into the air, she feels real aggression towards Brock for reasons that we will soon see. But she also, in this complicated moment, feels sexually attracted to Brock. Indeed, Hedda has a history of threatening men with guns because she feels sexual attraction to them, beginning with Lovborg. And perhaps the reason why she reacts so violently to the feeling of erotic desire in herself is that she regards that desire as putting her in a position of weakness. Now, the powerful Brock takes the symbol, this gun of destructive power, and, if you will, phallic appropriation from Hedda's hands, places it carefully back in the box and says, now we won't play at that game anymore today. His condescending words and actions are a reminder that as a man, and a well-connected man, Brack is in control of Hedda here, as he is indeed throughout the play. Just as Brack says, I know this pistol well, he also knows Hedda well. In fact, he knows her so well, this man who seems to see and know everything, that he's aware of certain unsavory aspects of Hedda's past that no one else is. Aspects of her past alluded to obliquely that seem to pose a threat to her social prominence or her reputation. Now, the conversation between Hedda and Brock bristles with sexual tension and erotic innuendo, implying that the two may have had some kind of sexual dalliance in the past, but that certainly Brock is bent on establishing one in the future. Hedda says, I had been in my room changing my dress ever since lunch, Brock says. And is there no sort of little chink that we could hold a parley through? Hedda, have you forgotten to arrange one? Brock, that was another piece of stupidity. Hedda. Well, we must settle down here and wait. Tesman is not likely to be back for some time yet. What's going on under the surface here? Hedda hints that she wouldn't mind if Brock arranged a little chink in her marriage where they could secretly meet and be together. And she mentions, pointedly, that Tesman will be gone for some time. Actually, he comes back a little sooner than expected. Now, these hints suggest that as a bored young woman, she would not be averse to an affair. The hints almost serve as a kind of sexual invitation. And the fact that Brock approached the house from the back door hints that this is what he certainly was expecting and hoping for. Picking up on Hedda's hints, Brock promises, in veiled language, a sexual arrangement that they could pursue in a certain way. But it's important to note that while Hedda is clearly sexually unsatisfied in her marriage, she is motivated here more by her desperate boredom, I think, than she is by erotic desire, though there is some of that as well. She tells Brock, quote, "How mortally bored I have been. That is, I am bored to death." Now, that's not just a figure of speech, mortally bored to death, because what Hedda feels isn't ordinary boredom, but rather a deeper malaise, a kind of existential ennui, a state of chronic emptiness that is really a form of serious depression and that is robbing her of her desire to live. She tells Brock, quote, "I often think that there is only one thing in the world I have a turn for, and that is boring myself to death." What Hedda calls boredom, then, is really, as I've suggested, a depression that feels like a kind of death in life, and that one, unchecked, could indeed drive her to death. Hedda finds no sustaining value, no interest, no purpose in her life as it is. As she tells Brock, quote, "I know of no reason why I should be happy. Perhaps you can give me one." Again, perhaps a kind of invitation, but also an expression of her own deep malaise. When Brock mentions that she's now living in the villa of the ex-cabinet minister, the one that she had wanted, Hedda claims, not very convincingly, that no, I didn't really want it. I was just humoring Tesman. And she complains now that she's there that the house, quote, "has an odor of mortality about it, like a bouquet the day after a ball." No sooner does she have what she thought she wanted than she doesn't desire it. Now, the sense of any interest in life, then, that flickered when she moved in is definitely now gone. And the sense of any life that might have flickered when Thea revealed her love for Loveborg was in some way threatened by the shadow of another woman, any hope that might have flickered in that had made Hedda momentarily pick up and take notice has quickly dissipated. Hedda now complains to Brock of how tedious life is with George Tesman and how she loves his academic work on, quote, domestic industries. She finds herself now in a kind of domestic prison with a man more interested in his work than in her. But even on their honeymoon, she said she found it, quote, most intolerable to be alone with Tesman. It's not just that he seems to ignore her, it's that she doesn't want to be around him. When Brock teasingly refers to Tesman as the man she loves, Hedda tells him, don't use that sickening word, love. Just as Hedda despises the idea that women are expected to find satisfaction running a household, so too she hates the cultural expectation that women are supposed to love their husbands, that love is somehow the special province of wives. This is one of the bourgeois lies that Hedda would like to rip away. Well, why then did Hedda marry Tesman? Well, I've noted two reasons. First, she acted on her misfounded hope that she could enjoy some kind of power by helping him become a prominent man. And she, in fact, even tries to revive that hope a little bit in talking to Brock by suggesting that perhaps Tesman might enter politics. But Brock says, no, that's not going to happen. Given his scholarly nature, given his temperament, that's a fantasy. And it's clearly a fantasy born out of desperation to influence some man. But it's an idea, of course, that is simply impossible. Now, also I noted that she married Tesman with the prospect of reestablishing her rightful place in the upper echelon of society. But now Hedda tells Brock that she lives in, quote, genteel poverty. The genteel poverty I have managed to drop into, which, quote, makes life so pitiable and so ludicrous. Any sense now of achieving a kind of social power base seems impossible. But it now emerges that there was a third reason why she married this man to whom she seems so poorly matched. When Brock asks why she accepted Tesman's proposal, Hedda now says, quote, I had positively danced myself tired, dear Judge. My day was done. And then, quote, Hedda shudders and she says, no, I won't say that, nor think it either. What is Hedda obliquely referring to in this guarded language, in this unfinished sentence? Well, to the dance of her dangerous past with men, that's one thing she's referring to, and possibly the dance of her dangerous past with Brock himself, as well as her intimacy with Lovborg. Those relationships, and perhaps others, could have ruined Hedda's reputation in a way that is so terrifying for a woman who fears the loss of reputation that she says, I can't even think about it. In fact, Brock is perhaps the only person in town who seems aware of some of these unsavory aspects of Hedda's past dance. And in this respect, he holds power over her, and Hedda is very much aware of that. When Brock tells her, surely you had no reason to worry, Hedda then answers, reasons, and then the stage direction tells us she is watching Brock closely to see how he reacts to that. Reasons, reasons. Does he know reasons? How much does he know? She's aware that Brock could ruin her reputation, though perhaps not exactly how at this point. And that understanding gives Brock power over her. Now, it emerges then in this conversation, this third reason why she married Tesman. It was partly to nullify the danger of exposing anything in her past. As she puts it, George Tesman, you must admit, is correctness itself. Yes, Brock says, he represents, quote, respectability. And it's clear that Hedda sought refuge from all potential scandal in the bourgeois respectability that Tesman embodies. Because she lives in terror of scandal, in a way that Thea does not, the idea of breaking away from Tesman or social convention is more than Hedda can even contemplate. Now, George Tesman is so predictably respectable that he's even concerned that Hedda might meet with her old associate Lovborg alone, even though he knows nothing specifically about their past at all. Nonetheless, it would be improper because he's an unmarried man and she's a married woman, unless, of course, Thea is there. And when he finds out Thea will be there, well, then, of course, it's fine. Respectability itself, social conformity, a kind of protection. But the problem is, of course, that Tesman's respectability is also for Hedda as boring as his work. And she is in despair and foreseeing a life of tedious marriage to this man. When Brock says, your wedding journey is over, meaning you're back home now, Hedda says, no, not by a long, long way. I have only arrived at a station on the line, meaning my marriage is a long, long journey. I see no end to it, and arriving back home is merely a station on the way. When Brock asks if she could jump out of this train, he means, of course, could you leave your marriage, say the way Thea Elfstead has? But Hedda is, by her own admission, too great a coward to make such a rebellious move. She's too concerned with what society might say. Later she admits that, quote, life would be livable, after all, if only one had courage. But she doesn't have that courage. Even though she despises the patriarchal construction of the social order, Hedda is afraid to rise up against its defining institution, marriage. She might, as the conversation with Brock suggests, have a covert affair, but she would never openly leave her husband. Seeing Hedda's unhappiness, seeing her need for diversion, and seeing her refusal to leave Tesman, Brock proposes an arrangement, probably the arrangement he had in mind when he arrives. Brock says, "All I require is a pleasant and intimate interior where I can make myself useful in every way. That's what I look for in the home of a friend, a place where I am free to come and go as a trusted friend." Hedda: "Of the master of the house, do you mean?" Brock: "Frankly, of the mistress, first of all, but of course, of the master too, a friend in the second place. Such a triangular relationship, if I may call it so, is really a great convenience for all parties. Let me tell you." To which Hedda says, "Yes, I have many a time longed for someone to make a third on our travels. Oh, those railway carriage tete-a-tetes." To which Brock replies, "Fortunately, your wedding journey is over." "No," she says, "it's not over." "Well, what would be possible then?" Brock says. "Suppose a third person were to jump in and join the couple in this train that is your marriage." "Ah, that would be quite another matter," Hedda says. "A trusted, sympathetic friend," Brock says. "Ah, well," Hedda replies, "that would be a great relief indeed." Brock hears the front door open and glances in that direction. "The triangle, then, is completed," he says. Hedda aloud, "And there goes the train," meaning, here comes my husband. There's George Tesman, arriving earlier than expected. Now, picking up on Hedda's metaphor of marriage as a long train journey, Brock suggests here, in this coded language, an adulterous affair with her that they would conduct behind Tesman's back and under the appearance of marriage and friendship, and presumably conduct in the house where they are currently sitting. Tesman's unexpected arrival at this moment, however, hints at the improbability of this proposed scheme ever really developing. But Hedda is tempted to it, and not just as an alternative to her boredom and to the stifling trappings of her marriage and her domestic life. She also goes along with it because, as I've noted, Brock holds power over her, a power that Hedda fears and resents and is in some ways afraid to resist in any open way. It might cause retaliation. Thus, while she finds Brock's sexual dynamism and his masculine power alluring, she also fears these aspects of Brock, and even more, she fears what he could do to her reputation. Keep in mind that Brock's very title, judge, confers not just his profession but his authority. So there's a definite undercurrent of coercion in his proposal. And there's also, I think, an undercurrent of genuine aggression on Hedda's part when, as he was arriving at the house, she fired the gun at him as he approached. Hedda's aggression, however, is also directed at less threatening sources, like Aunt Julia, whom she tells Brock she deliberately insulted by pretending that the aunt's bonnet belonged to a servant. We had thought perhaps this might have simply been a mistake, but no, it wasn't. And when he's asked why she would do such a thing, Hedda, nervously crossing the room, says, "Well, you see, these impulses come all over me of a sudden, and I cannot resist them." She throws herself down in the easy chair by the stove. "Oh, I don't know how to explain it." Now, note that Hedda's unkindness and resentment toward the well-meaning Julia, though she cannot explain them, clearly have multiple sources that perhaps we can explain. First, Hedda looks down on Julia as a middle-class woman. She also, however, bristles at the fact that she and Tesman are indebted to Julia for the comfortable house that they have just moved into. But perhaps above all, she resents and dislikes Julia's blithe assumption that having children in marriage is a woman's natural fulfillment. When Brock, suspecting Hedda himself, might be pregnant, and asks if she's ready for, quote, a solemn new responsibility, Hedda again acts with horror and revulsion and denial at the idea of her pregnancy. Quote, nothing of that sort will ever happen, disavowing it. Now, Brock responds with a question that reveals how different and isolated Hedda is from other members of her sex. He asks, are you so unlike the generality of women as to have no turn for such duties? Do you really feel no maternal instincts at all? Well, clearly, Hedda feels none. She is unlike the generality of women in that regard. Now, one could argue, and some have argued, that Hedda is a kind of victim of biology, a male sensibility and temperament trapped in a woman's body. But I think it's more accurate to regard Hedda as an inherently passionate, creative woman stifled by the narrow gender strictures of late 19th century Norway and the suggestion that a woman can only be a woman if she is hyperfeminine, wifely, and determined to become pregnant. When Lovborg arrives at the house, Ibsen describes him as lean but, quote, somewhat worn out with a long, pale face. Lovborg looks as if he has passed through trials, indeed he has, and struggles that have aged him, but he possesses intellectual ambitions and the desire to make his mark on the world that are utterly lacking in Tesman. Indeed, he also has the capacity for that. Although his book on the progress of civilization has caused a great stir, Lovborg pulls from his pocket a manuscript of what he regards as a more important follow-up, a book that follows the trajectory, historically, of the recently published volume, but now moves into the future in a visionary way, and in so doing expresses, more than the first book, the man himself. Now, as the handwriting in the manuscript that he shows indicates, this soon-to-be published, but still unpublished book is one that he dictated, as he had the first one, to Thea, as not only his amanuensis, but his muse, his inspiration. Lovborg says, and now I mean to win myself a position again, to make a fresh start. Tesman, a little embarrassed. And that is what you wish to do, eh? Yes. Lovborg, smiling, lays down his hat and draws a packet wrapped in paper from his coat pocket. But when this one appears, George Tesman, you will have to read it, for this is a real book, the book I have put all myself into. This one deals with the future. The first deals with the civilizing forces of the future, and here is the second, running through the pages toward the end, forecasting the probable line of development. Well, this is ambitious indeed. This is visionary. Now, although Lovborg says, I now mean to win a position for myself again, to make a fresh start after my alcoholic dissipation, and that he means to do this both with the soon-to-be-published book and a series of lectures he'll be giving, he nonetheless assures Tesman a bit later that he does not want to vie for the academic position that Tesman had been expecting. He's not going to stab his old fellow in the back that way. They have been academic rivals before, but not, Lovborg says, in a way that would cause him to want to subvert Tesman. Indeed, he wants Tesman to read his book. Rather, he tells Tesman, it's only the moral victory I care for now. Well, presumably, Lovborg means he cares about demonstrating the superiority of his ideas, and that moral victory is more important than taking an academic post that Tesman thought he would get. Lovborg's remarkable self-confidence here rests on his belief in his work and in his belief in his control over himself. But is this self-confidence as stable as it appears? Well, actually, no. It turns out that it's quite fragile because Lovborg's belief both in his work and in his sobriety derive from Thea's belief in him. It is she who has made the transformation possible. Now, Brock senses this weakness and tries to tempt Lovborg to drink and return to his old ways of dissipation that evening. Why? Well, in part as an exercise of his own male power. Anytime he has an opportunity, Brock likes competitively to exercise power over other men. Thus, knowing about, as everyone does, about Loveborg's drinking problem, he says, we shall be quite a select little circle tonight, and you might bring your manuscript with you to read to Tesman at my house. Well, aware of Hedda's attraction to Loveborg, and envious of Loveborg's recent celebrity as well, Brock sees him as a rival. He wants, in urging him to come to his house for this party, for men only, he wants to separate Loveborg from Hedda's company, and in luring Loveborg to his house to get him to drink and thereby demonstrate how weak, in fact, this celebrity really is. Now, remember that in the stage set, even though Brock is in with George Tesman off to the side, Ibsen describes him looking through from that adjoining room into the foreground where we find Loveborg talking with Hedda and seeing the intensity of their reunion in their faces, even though we can't hear their words. They're alone together. The audience, however, can hear their words. And what Brock infers about the intensity of the relationship is certainly borne out by what we hear. As soon as he enters, he can't take his eyes off Hedda. She has been the shadow who has haunted his thoughts for years. Hedda Gabler. Hedda, glancing at him hastily, says, hush. Oh, he says, Hedda Gabler. Hedda, looking at the album. This was my name in the old days when we two knew each other, and I must teach myself never to say Hedda Gabler again, never, as long as I live. Hedda, still turning over pages from the album. Yes, you must teach yourself, and I think you ought to practice in time. The sooner the better, I should say. Loveborg in a tone of indignation. Hedda Gabler married to George Tesman? Yes, so the world goes, she says. Oh, Hedda, how could you throw yourself away? Hedda looked sharply at him. What? I can't allow this. Now, note here that although Hedda pretends to be displeased at Loveborg's come on here, at his obvious expression of devotion and interest and jealousy, even though she pretends to be displeased, she's obviously flattered. She's glad that she still has the power to attract this man who has now become such a sensation. And indeed, she's pleased that Loveborg uses the intimate pronoun form for you, and that he seems jealous of Tesman. All of these things secretly delight her. When Tesman comes in, Hedda works up Loveborg's jealousy for him further by pretending to care for her husband as she shows Loveborg the travel photographs from the Tyrol. Looking affectionately up at Tesman, she says, "Oh, what's the name of these curious peaks, dear?" A moment later, she heightens Loveborg's desire further by admitting that she doesn't really love her husband, even as she continues to hold him at arm's length away from herself. He says, may I say do when we are alone? May I speak intimately when we are alone? To which Hedda says, you may think it, but you mustn't say it. Ah, Loveborg says, I understand. It's an offense against George Tesman, who you love? Hedda glances at him and smiles. Love? What an idea. You don't love him then? Hedda says, but I won't hear any sort of unfaithfulness. Remember that. Yes, I don't love my husband, but stay. Keep your distance. Now, note here that with so little power in her life, Hedda clearly enjoys her ability in this scene to control and heighten Loveborg's feelings for her. It recalls for her the power that she used to enjoy, or at least feel, in his company in their intimate friendship years before, when she was able to extract confessions from Loveborg, among other things, about his wild way of life. This comes out in the conversation. Hedda says, as I look back on it all, I think there was really something beautiful, something fascinating, something daring in that secret intimacy, that comradeship which no living creatures so much as dreamed of. Loveborg says, yes, Hedda. And when I made my confessions to you, told you about myself, things that at the time no one else knew, there I would sit and tell you of my escapades, my days and nights of devilment. Oh, Hedda, what was the power in you that forced me to confess those things? Do you think it was any power in me? Hedda asks. Loveborg, how else can I explain it? In all those roundabout questions you used to put to me. Oh, tell me, Hedda, was there not love at the bottom of our friendship? On your side, you did not feel, did you, as though you might purge my stains away if I made you my confessor? Was it not so? Was it not love? No, not quite. Well, what was your motive then? Hedda says, do you think it quite incomprehensible that a young girl, when it can be done without anyone knowing, should be glad to have a peep now and then into a male world, which she is forbidden to know anything about? Now, back then, Hedda thrilled not just at her emotional intimacy with Loveborg, and not just at her power to make him confess things, but she also thrilled vicariously at the glimpses of a kind of free, dynamic male life that he led and that he confessed to her. He offered her peeps of forbidden pleasures closed off to women. So there was a kind of triple gratification for her in the relationship. Even now she wishes, she says later, she could be present unseen at Brock's male-only party, like a kind of fly on the wall. Now, Hedda, in this conversation, is clearly gratified that Loveborg still recalls so vividly her power to force confessions out of him, and that these memories, she now knows, cast such a shadow over his present life, a life that seemed to be dominated by Thea, but in which she now fully understands she has played a role. But back in the past, when they were so close, at a time when Hedda was merely a teenager, she seemed interested in Loveborg's descriptions of his devilment, and yet even then she also wanted to mold him. It was not just the pleasure of power to get him to disclose his life as a man. It was also her idea that she could mold him and control him in some other way. She imagined him then, quote, with vine leaves in his hair. Now, by this vision she had then, she meant that she could somehow influence him to become a man so inspired by the creative power of the god Dionysius that it would be as if he had the vine leaves of Dionysius in his hair as a manifestation of that potency, that intellectual creativity that she was somehow bringing out in him. That's the kind of power that she really sought then and has sought ever since. But remember that Dionysius is also the god of wine and the god of drunkenness. And it was that aspect of vine leaves that, at that point in their relationship, dominated Loveborg, and that he often told her about. He didn't then realize his visionary potential under Hedda's influence, as Hedda had hoped then, and she didn't inspire him to do it the way Thea clearly has. Well, Hedda's resistance to Loveborg now, or one might say her pretense of holding him at arm's length, isn't just a renewed attempt to exercise shaping power by demonstrating that she can have her way with him. What she's doing in this scene, in holding herself back, is also punishing Loveborg for something. Specifically, she is punishing him for causing the disruption that ended their friendship, their intense emotional intimacy years earlier when she was still a girl. What happened? At that time, Loveborg wanted to sexualize the relationship. Hedda says, "The fault was yours, Loveborg. It was you that broke with me." "Yes," Hedda says, when our friendship threatened to develop into something more serious. Shame upon you, Eilert Loveborg. How could you think of wronging your frank companion?" Loveborg, clenching his hands. "Oh, why did you not carry out your threat? Why did you not shoot me down then?" To which Hedda says, "Because I have such a dread of scandal." Yes, Loveberg, says Hedda, you are a coward at heart. Yes, Hedda agrees, I'm a terrible coward. But then, a moment later, something remarkable happens. And that is that Hedda confesses that although she reacted by threatening to shoot Loveborg and held back only because of the cowardly fear of scandal, she's a coward in another way at that moment. Now I will confide something to you. Well, what? It was the fact that I dared not shoot you down. Yes, that was not my most arrant cowardice that evening. Loveborg looks at her a moment and understands and whispers passionately, Oh, Hedda Gabler, now I begin to see a hidden reason beneath our comradeship. You, the intimate you, and I. After all, then, it was your craving for life, and he realizes also your craving for me. Now, Hedda, who was much younger and inexperienced, threatened to shoot Loveborg in a kind of hysterical state because she regarded his introduction of sexual desire into their friendship as a betrayal of their emotional intimacy. She says truthfully that she was too much of a coward to shoot him because she feared scandal, but then confesses, as I've suggested, that she was also afraid of something else even more, and that was clearly afraid to act on the sexual desire that she felt for him. She was terrified of that desire. And thus, Loveborg now, with this confession, understands that this hidden feeling in Hedda in the past was there, and now he wants to build on it in the present. But at this moment of heightened erotic tension, all of which, remember, in a certain way, Brock can see from the other room, at this moment, Thea Elvsted arrives. Feeling that she has Loveborg under her spell, Hedda, however, now wants to exert power over little Thea to demonstrate how weak her rival really is. When Thea tries to sit next to Loveborg, for example, Hedda immediately redirects her and says, No, I will sit between you. Now, a moment later, Hedda is deflated, however, and moved to jealousy once again when Loveborg praises Thea in language that Hedda wants and had wanted for herself. Now, Loveborg, looking at Thea, says, She and I, we are two real comrades. We have absolute faith in each other. Thea says, Oh, how happy I am to hear that, Hedda, for only think, he says I have inspired him too. Hedda looks at her with a smile. Ah, does he say that? Does he say that, dear? Loveborg then adds, And then she is so brave, Mrs. Tesman. Good heavens, am I brave? Thea asks. Loveborg says, Exceedingly, where your comrade is concerned. Hedda, ah yes, courage. If only one had that. What then? What do you mean? If I now had courage, Hedda says, then perhaps life would be livable. No, I don't have courage. Thea, you claim, does. And Thea, indeed, though he doesn't know Thea's left her husband, has demonstrated it even more to Hedda by acknowledging that she has left her husband. Now, Hedda's jealous response to this emotional bond of support and inspiration that Loveborg and Thea articulate here is to strike out at both of them and to try to destabilize their trust in each other. She's jealous. She's angry. Now, she tries to destabilize their relationship first by getting them both to drink spiked punch, which they both refuse to do in a show of sobriety, solidarity, if you will. But Hedda then persists and says, You know, you really must take a drink on account of other people. Loveborg says, Other people? Hedda says, Yes, otherwise people might be apt to suspect that in your heart of hearts you did not feel quite secure, quite confident in yourself. Thea says, softly, Please, Hedda, oh, please. Loveborg, people may suspect what they like for the present. Oh, please, let them, just... Thea says, Let them suspect. Don't take a drink. Hedda, I saw it plainly on Judge Brack's face a moment ago. What did you see? his contemptuous smile when you dared not go with them into that inner room where they were drinking punch. Dared not? Of course I preferred to stop here and talk to you. To which Thea says, what could be more natural, Hedda? To which Hedda then says, but the judge could not guess that. And I saw, too, the way that Brock smiled and glanced at Tesman when you dared not accept his invitation to this wretched little supper party of his. To which Loveberg says, but I won't go. I will stay here with you and Thea. Now, Hedda's cunning here is really worthy of Medea. Knowing Loveborg's weakness for alcohol, she tries to seduce him by suggesting that unless he drinks, people will think that he's not sure of his own powers of self-control, that he's not confident in himself. And she suggests that other men in particular, well-connected men like Brock, will regard his sobriety, or let us say his abstinence from drink, as a weakness and sneer at it, wondering whether in fact it isn't a demonstration that he isn't really confident in himself. Well, this ploy fails when, to Thea's relief, Loveborg says, no, I will stay here with you two. I won't go in there with the men and drink. But at that point, Hedda lets slip that Thea had come to her earlier in the day in a state of, quote, mortal terror about you, Loveborg, fearing that you might relapse into drinking again in a city without support. She doesn't have to say all this, but she says enough. As soon as she mentions Thea's earlier state of distraction and mortal terror, Loveborg says, what is all this, Mrs. Tesman? To which Thea then says, oh my God, Hedda, what are you saying? What are you doing? Hedda, oh, don't get excited. That horrible Judge Brack is sitting watching you. Loveborg then says, so she was in mortal terror, was she? On my account? Oh, Hedda, now you have ruined everything, Thea says. Loveborg then looking fixedly at her a moment. His face is distorted as he gazes at Thea. So that was my comrade's frank confidence in me? Oh, my dearest friend. Oh, let me tell you. Loveborg takes one of the glasses of punch and raises it to his lips and says in a low, husky voice, your health, Thea. He empties the glass and puts it down and then takes a second. Miss Elvsted, softly, oh, Hedda, how could you do this? Hedda, what, me? Are you crazy? I didn't do anything. To which Loveborg then says, here's to your health too, Miss Tesman. Thanks for the truth. Hooray for the truth. Drinking cynically to these women at a moment now when, for the first time in years, he's not only drinking, but drinking because he's lost confidence in himself. When Loveborg hears that Thea doubted his ability to stay sober and had expressed that concern earlier in the day to Hedda, Loveborg feels betrayed. He wonders whether the intimate friendship and collaboration and support he enjoyed with Thea was real. She didn't really have the confidence in him, it appears, that inspired his writings and that gave him confidence in himself. If she didn't really have that confidence, then how can he have confidence in himself or in his work? Now, it's a terrible moment, a destabilizing moment, a moment of self-doubt for Loveborg. He doesn't realize that Thea's deeper motive in coming to the town was not concern for his lapsing back into drink so much as it was her passionate love for him. She was indeed concerned about the fragility of his sobriety, but the real reason that he doesn't yet understand, and perhaps never will, was that she was leaving her husband for him. So that when he sarcastically then takes a drink defiantly and toasts Thea's health in a moment of derision, he is punishing Thea for what he takes to be her lack of faith in him, a lack of faith in him that now threatens his own self-esteem. But Loveborg is also doing something else here. Even as he's striking out at Thea, he is also trying at the same time defiantly to demonstrate to himself and to the world that he's strong enough to drink and still maintain his self-possession, even though at the same time the very fact that he's taking the drink as a response to his self-doubts. So after downing then 2 glasses of strong punch and pouring another, he proclaims that this is a test that will make him stronger. He says, don't be angry with me, my dear comrade, looking at Thea. You shall see, both of you and the others, that if I was fallen once, now I have risen again thanks to you, Thea. And again, Thea's radiant with joy. Oh, heaven be praised. Now, note that here, ironically, Lovborg's suddenly renewed self-confidence, his belief that he has demonstrated to himself in taking these drinks that he can control it, and that he doesn't have to rely on Thea's support to be confident in his own creative and self-controlling capacities. His confidence, or his renewed ability to do that, isn't rooted in any genuine faith in itself. It's rooted in the fact that he's just had 2 drinks of alcohol. He feels now as if he's regained confidence, when in fact the thing that's given him confidence is the thing that will destroy him. Now, it's clear that he's not going to be able to stop when he decides to go to Brock's party, which is, after all, going to be a kind of drunken orgy. And it's clear, too, that although he promises that he will come and pick up Thea at 10 o'clock and take her back to her hotel, that is not going to happen. The trajectory of his descent is clear, and he's deceiving himself if he imagines that somehow the feeling he has after taking a drink is the same as self-confidence. Now, Hedda foresees that Lovborg will struggle, and that in doing so, he will destroy his relationship with Thea, which she has now subverted. But she imagines that this drinking will provide her with an opportunity to make Lovborg rise under her influence in the way that she wanted to in the past and believes that she can now reshape him in the future. Thus, near the end of Act 2, as Thea is agonized at what will happen to him, Hedda says, then you will see. He will have regained control over himself when he returns. Then he will be a free man for all his days. He'll be free of his fear of drinking. He'll have demonstrated to himself his power and command and self-control. He will come in as I see him, so, and not otherwise. She rises and approaches Thea. You may doubt him as long as you please, but I believe in him. And now we will try. Oh, to which Thea says, you have some hidden motive in this, Hedda. Hedda says, yes, I have. I want for once in my life to have power to mold a human destiny. Have you not the power? Thea asks. I have not, and I've never had it. Not your husband's? Do you think that is worth the trouble? Hedda says. Oh, if you could only understand, Thea, how poor I am, and fate has made you so rich. She clasped Thea passionately in her arms. I think I must burn your hair off after all. Come, have a little tea. Come, have a cup of tea with me, you little stupid. Almost by force, she drives Thea toward the door. Okay. Now, the ability to mold a human destiny is, of course, what Hedda has always wanted to do with a man, as the form of power that she thinks is the only one available to a woman. And Hedda speaks as if she has now already taken possession of Lovborg's destiny and is controlling it as she sent him off. She feels and speaks as if she has now displaced Thea as his muse and inspiration. She insists that the new Lovborg will be as she sees him, and that he will succeed because she, Hedda, believed in him enough to tempt him to drink and demonstrate to himself he could control himself. Thus, she imagines that he'll be sitting at the party, quote, reading his manuscript with vine leaves in his hair, exactly as she had imagined him when she was a girl. But of course, this is as great a self-delusion on her part as Lovborg is deluded in imagining that somehow the confidence he feels is genuine confidence after 2 glasses of punch. But for the resurrection that in him that Hedda wants to occur, Lovborg must first, as we've seen, violate his bond with Thea by drinking, so that then under Hedda's influence he can discover that he possesses the necessary self-control and thereby credit Hedda for it. A woman we've already noted that he still desires, but now will love even more and be all the more subject to when he recognizes that she has prompted this breakthrough into genuine self-confidence. Now, this plan, of course, is what Thea senses but can't put her finger on, and what she refers to as your hidden motive. Hedda complains in this conversation that Thea has been made rich by her relationship with Lovborg, and Hedda envies that richness in the poverty of her own life with Tesman. But Hedda feels that she, after all, has a prior claim on Lovborg in the past, though she doesn't explain that to Thea. She certainly feels that way, and now she feels she is reclaiming that relationship. And that the moment in which the two of them confess their submerged passion for one another earlier in the scene, earlier in the act, it was at that moment that she felt that she could and was able to reclaim him and to shape him according to the destiny that she desired. Now, in sending Lovborg off then with punch in his veins, Hedda was reasserting that earlier bond and imagining somehow that her desire for self-fulfillment through the muse-like inspiration of a man would occur. At the end of Act 2, she exults then in her power over Thea. She would like to destroy this smaller woman, to burn off her hair, not merely again as a rival and now one she feels that she has vanquished, but also to burn off Thea's hair as an embodiment of the feminine weakness that Hedda despises in her own sex. Quote, "I think I must burn your hair off now, as I threatened to when we were girls. I must burn it off after all." Okay. Act 3 is, I think, the most impressive in the play. As Ibsen executes it with extraordinary compression and psychological complexity, he reveals that this play is really building toward a double tragedy, that of both Hedda and Lovborg. The night is past now. It's morning as Act 3 opens, and Lovborg has not returned. Thea is still awake, having waited nervously, anxiously for Lovborg for at least 8 hours. Meanwhile, Hedda has slept soundly, suggesting that Hedda now feels confident in her erasure of Thea's influence and in her power to inspire and shape Lovborg in the future in her own way, so confident that she could sleep soundly. When Hedda awakens, she looks at her reflection in a hand mirror and arranges her hair in anticipation of Lovborg's return. But he arrives in a very different condition that she had hoped and expected, and his arrival is preceded by 2 others. First Tesman and then Brock, both of whom shatter Hedda's hopes about molding Lovborg's destiny. Tesman reports that Lovborg indeed did read him part of his manuscript, and he says, quote, I believe it is one of the most remarkable things that have ever been written. It's so extraordinary indeed that it even inspires jealousy in the normally tepid Tesman. Now, Hedda likes the idea of Lovborg's genius, but she has no interest in the book itself because, problematically, of course, she wasn't the one who inspired it. Thea was. But then Tesman describes what followed that evening after Lovborg had dazzled him with the reading from his book. He says, "Oh, how pitiful to think that he, with all his gifts, should be irreclaimable after all." Hedda says, "I suppose you mean that he has more courage than the rest." "Oh, no, Hedda, not at all. I mean that Lovborg is incapable of taking his pleasures in moderation." "And what came of it all then, in the end?" "Oh, well, to tell the truth, Hedda, I think it might be best described as an orgy." "Had he vine leaves in his hair?" "Vine leaves? No, I saw nothing of the sort. But he had made a long, rambling speech in honor of the woman who had inspired him in his work. That was the phrase he used. Did he name the woman? No, he didn't, but I can't help thinking that he meant Mrs. Elvsted. You may be sure that he did. Okay, this is devastating for Hedda. Tesman's account of Lovborg's conduct the previous night destroys the image that Hedda had been nurturing of Lovborg in two ways. First, rather than proving that he could drink and still govern himself under the influence of drink, as Hedda had predicted and had arranged, Lovborg instead merely became sloppily intoxicated and later staggered off to another party at Mademoiselle Diana's brothel. But the second and more devastating disclosure here is that Lovborg's drunken tribute was not to Hedda, but to Thea. Later, he speaks of the work that the two of them collaborated on, that she inspired not as his own book, but rather my book and Thea's book, for that's what it is. And he even speaks of it, as she does, as the child to which they gave birth together. Now, Hedda hides her disappointment here, but when Tesman presents, quote, the precious irreplaceable manuscript which Lovborg dropped on the street as he staggered off from one orgy to another, when he presents that, Hedda's frustrated rage to create or shape Lovborg suddenly becomes a desire to destroy him as her only form of power. The only power she believes she now has over a man is over his death and over the death of his manuscript. Tesman anticipates the state of, quote, despair that he's sure Lovborg will experience when he imagines him waking up and finding the manuscript missing. And so Tesman plans to return it to him later that day. But when he reads Julia's letter that his Aunt Rena is dying and is ready to rush off to the dying aunt's bedside, Hedda takes the opportunity to snatch the manuscript before he can appropriate it. Because for Hedda, this carelessly lost manuscript signifies Thea's power over Lovborg in the past, but it also, this dropped manuscript, signifies to her Lovborg's betrayal of her idea of him. He's gotten drunk. He's paid tribute to another woman. He's lost the manuscript. Now, Brock's account, when he comes in, of Lovborg's drunken antics at Mademoiselle Diane's only heightens Hedda's disdain for Lovborg and deep disappointment in him. Brock says that when he arrived there, he accused Diana and her friends of robbing him of the manuscript. And in the violence that followed in the melee, Lovborg struck a policeman and was arrested. Now, we've noted that Hedda fears scandal, even more than she fears her stifling marriage, even more than she fears the prospect of motherhood. So when Brock then tells her, quote, henceforth, as before, every respectable house will be closed to Eilbert Lovborg, when he says that, Brock makes it clear that Hedda should not and cannot see him. Now, remember, he has a reason for this. Brock saw Lovborg and Hedda's intense connection and wanted to separate them in order to promote his own covert sexual relationship with her and in order to demonstrate his own male power. Now, remember that Hedda was receptive, or at least intrigued at first, by the secret affair that he had proposed. But now Brock resorts to coercion and blackmail in order to ensure that Hedda will accede to his sexual plans. He makes Hedda aware that he has the power to ruin her reputation by suggesting that she has allowed Lovborg to meet with the married Thea in her house, and that spun in a way that he could spin it, it would make her appear as if she was sanctioning some kind of adulterous relationship, something that would stain her character in the public eye. Clearly, Brock wants to remove Lovborg as a sexual rival. But as I've noted, he also simply enjoys exercising power. Power over men and certainly power over women. Especially, perhaps, he enjoys exercising power over Hedda, a woman who craves power herself and had earlier rather carelessly come close to shooting him. The kind of power he wants, then, is such that apart from the affair that he is envisioning, Brock seems to take a kind of erotic delight in the exercise of power itself. Consider this conversation. He says, henceforth all respectable houses will be closed to Lovborg. Hedda says, and so ought mine be, you mean? Yes, I confess it would be more painful to me, says Brock, if this personage were to be made free of your house. How superfluous, how intrusive he would be if he were to force his way into the triangle, Hedda asks. Precisely, Hedda says. So you want to be the one cock in the basket. Is that your aim, Judge? Brock nods slowly and lowers his voice. Yes, that is my aim, and for that I will fight with every weapon I can command. Hedda, smile vanishing. I see you're a very dangerous person when it comes to the point. Oh, do you think so? I'm beginning to think so. And I am exceedingly glad to think that you have no sort of hold over me. Brock laughs equivocally. Well, Miss Hedda, perhaps you are right there. If I had, no one knows what I might be capable of. Oh, come now, Judge Brack. That sounds almost like a threat. Oh, not at all. The triangle, you know. Well, of course, it is a threat. Now, Brock is, as the passage makes clear, all cock, okay, in every sense of the term. Unlike Hedda, he is incapable of guilt and absolutely amoral, and he is capable, as he says himself, of doing anything. His weapons, which he refers to, include his knowledge not just of how it would look if Hedda were held accountable for bringing an unmarried woman who had ran away from her husband together with Lovborg in her own house, but his weapons also include his knowledge of the unsavory details of Hedda's past. He's obviously then threatening her here, even when he says he's not. She must give up any thoughts of Lovborg. She must comply with what Brock euphemistically calls their triangle. That is, comply to carrying on an affair with him under the guise of a family friendship. When Lovborg enters, everything in his words indicate that it is now too late. Indeed, it is. He is in a state of despair because he believes he has lost the manuscript, and he is consumed with shame and self-hatred for having done so. Yet, the human destruction that follows turns upon Hedda's failure to inform him that indeed the work that he thought he lost has been found. For Lovborg, the loss of the manuscript through drunkenness is essentially the fatal loss of his self-confidence in himself as a man and as a writer. He tells Thea that they must part. You can be of no service to me now because I can do no more work. But why then does Lovborg claim and tell her, quote, I have torn the manuscript into 1,000 pieces, Thea. I have torn my life into pieces, so why should I not tear my life's work? Why, also, when Thea asks, when Thea says, you have killed our child, does he say, yes, it is a sort of child murder? Why claim that he has murdered the child, torn up the manuscript, rather than merely losing it? Well, Lovborg has several motives, I think, in this lie. First, he lies to drive Thea away for her own sake. He feels that he is utterly worthless and disgraced and does not want Thea tarnished by further association with him. He says, what would you have people see her walking with me down the street? I won't even take her back to her hotel. It would be too shameful. It would be too much of a tarnish on Thea's character. And remember, he doesn't really know that she's left her husband to seek him. Thus, he's trying to protect her reputation by driving her away from him. But Lovborg also lies here because he is too ashamed to admit what he regards as a far greater betrayal of Thea than tearing up the work would have been, and that is that he, quote, lost our child. He lost the child in a, quote, a night of riot and debauchery. That he cannot tell her. That would be too agonizing. His shame is too intense to admit that. Finally, however, there's a third reason for the lie. Lovborg lies to punish Thea because he feels that she has failed him even as he has failed her. He began drinking, remember, when he learned that she'd expressed concern to Hedda about his welfare. And after Thea has gone in a state of deep despair, Lovborg says, "It will not end with last night. I know that perfectly well." He's not referring to his drinking. He's referring to his failures. And the thing is that now I have no taste for that sort of life either. I won't begin it anew. She, Thea, has broken my courage and my power of braving life out. Hedda, looking straight before her. So that pretty little fool has had her fingers in a man's destiny. Yes, she did, but now he has cast her off because he blames Thea for destabilizing initially his own confidence in himself by her doubts about him, which caused him to drink. Now, why doesn't Hedda, surely we ask, seize this opportunity in the moment of Lovborg's greatest despair to try again to shape his life by telling him that indeed she has the manuscript? Why doesn't she make that opportunity, particularly when he says, all that I want to do now is, quote, make an end of it all. All I want to do now is die. Well, I think Hedda withholds revealing to him that the manuscript has been found because, after all, he failed her that night and she cannot forgive him. But also because the child that he created with Thea, this manuscript, is something that she does not want to exist because it was the work of another woman. And also she doesn't tell him that the manuscript still exists because she now knows that she will never be able to influence him the way Thea has, given his tributes to Thea. And finally, she doesn't tell him the truth about the manuscripts being found by Tesman because the disgraced Lovborg's very proximity to Hedda is now in itself a threat to her reputation, so they can't be together then in any public sense. She can't, even if it were possible, influence him because he's been too discredited. She wants nothing to do with a man who would in some way tarnish her reputation. Thus, she conceals the truth. She keeps the manuscript hidden. Now, as I've noted, Lovborg wants only to die. And Hedda's final desire then, as I've suggested, is to shape a man's life in the only way that she feels she can, and that is to direct his death, to somehow encourage him collaboratively to kill himself and make it a work of art, so that in his death, if not of his life, somehow there will be a sense of her influence, her power, her inspiration, perverse though it may seem. Thus, when he says that he is ready to make an end of it, the sooner the better, she says, Albert Lovborg, listen to me. Will you not try to do it beautifully? Beautifully? With wine leaves in my hair as you used to dream in the old days? No. I've lost my faith in those wine leaves, she says. But beautifully, nevertheless, for once in a way. Ah, in what way is that? I want to give you a memento to take with you. She goes to the writing table and opens the drawer and the pistol case, and then returns to Lovborg with one of the pistols. Lovborg looks at her. This is the memento? Hedda, nodding slowly. Do you recognize it? It was aimed at you once. You should have used it then, Hedda. Take it, and do use it now. Lovborg puts the pistol in his breast pocket. Thanks, he says. Hedda, do it beautifully, Iward, Lovborg. Promise me that. Promise me you will do it as I have instructed, so that your death will become a testament, if nothing else, to my shaping power over a man in his extinction. Now, Hedda who says she cannot bear sickness and death because they are ugly, wants to make Loveborg's suicide a collaborative work of art, the creation of something which she calls beautiful. When he goes off with a pistol, she then burns his manuscript in the stove in a moment of destructive perversity, throwing in piece at a time, "Now I'm burning your child, Thea, burning it, curly locks," throwing in one more, "Quire into the stove, your child, and Iwert Loveborg's." She throws in the rest, I am burning your child." Now, consider the layers of implication here. In incinerating Loveborg's life's work, and in calling it a child, as they had, Hedda is burning several things associated with that manuscript. She is burning Thea, with her curly locks, who inspired that work. She is burning Loveborg, who has failed to live up to Hedda's own ideal, and whom she has just sent off to die in the way she wants. And figuratively, Hedda is also burning her own unwanted child, the child that she is carrying. Thus, when she says, I am burning, it's self-referential. Instead of creating a literary child with Loveborg, as Thea had, to her horror, Hedda has created a real one with Tesman.